The rain began in the spring of 1315, a relentless, weeping sky that refused to yield. It was as if the heavens themselves were mourning a loss yet to come. For Agnes and the rest of her village, it signaled the beginning of a slow, agonizing descent into despair. Even Father Thomas, a man of unwavering faith, felt a tremor of unease. The endless rain seemed to mock his prayers, a cold, indifferent force that drowned both the land and the spirit. Lord Geoffrey, from his vantage point, felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily upon him. He knew the stores were not limitless, and the sight of the ruined fields filled him with a growing dread. Agnes trudged home, her hope dwindling with each step. The dampness seeped into her bones, mirroring the chill that had settled in her heart. The thought of her children, their hungry faces, spurred her onward. The meager fire offered little warmth, and the pot remained stubbornly empty. Agnes rationed what little grain they had left, knowing it would only delay the inevitable. Father Thomas moved amongst his flock, offering words of comfort and prayers for deliverance, but even his faith felt frail against the rising tide of despair. He saw the hunger in their eyes, the desperation etched on their faces, and felt his own spirit begin to crumble. Geoffrey wrestled with the accounts, the numbers painting a bleak picture. The stores were dwindling faster than anticipated, and he knew difficult choices lay ahead. His duty was to his people, but also to the crown, a precarious balance he feared he could not maintain. Driven by desperation, Agnes ventured into the woods, hoping to find something, anything, to stave off the gnawing hunger. But the forest offered little solace, the meager offerings already picked clean by others equally desperate. In the solitude of his church, Father Thomas wrestled with his faith. Where was God in this suffering? Why had he abandoned his people to this endless torment? Doubt, a serpent he had always kept at bay, began to coil around his heart. Geoffrey gathered the villagers, his face grim. He announced the inevitable: rations would be reduced. Murmurs of discontent rippled through the crowd, a storm brewing beneath the surface of their despair. Back in her hut, Agnes divided the last of their bread, each crumb a precious commodity. She offered a silent prayer, not for deliverance, but for the strength to endure what was to come. The endless rain continued to fall, washing away hope and leaving behind only the bitter taste of hunger and the looming shadow of the harvest yet to come. Or perhaps never to come. The rain continued its relentless assault. The stores from the previous harvest were dwindling faster than anyone dared admit. In Agnes's home, the reality of empty granaries was beginning to bite. In the village church, Father Thomas led his flock in prayer. He begged for divine intervention, for a break in the unending rain, for a miracle to stave off the encroaching starvation. His voice, though filled with conviction, trembled with his own growing doubts. Lord Geoffrey, weighed down by his responsibilities, inspected the granary. The dwindling grain stores were a stark reminder of the coming hardship. He knew difficult decisions lay ahead, decisions that would determine who lived and who perished. The thin broth was barely enough to fill their bellies, but Agnes stretched it as far as she could. She watched her children eat, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. How long could she sustain them like this? Father Thomas walked from house to house, offering what solace he could. His words often felt hollow, even to him, but he persisted, clinging to the hope that faith could offer some measure of comfort in the face of despair. Lord Geoffrey met with his steward, wrestling with the accounts. Every calculation pointed to the same grim conclusion: the village would soon run out of food. He authorized further rationing, knowing it would only delay the inevitable. Agnes, driven by desperation, scoured the woods for anything edible. Roots, berries, anything to stave off the gnawing hunger that plagued her family. The land, however, offered little respite. Father Thomas preached of perseverance, of hope in the face of adversity, but his words felt hollow, even to himself. The desperation in the eyes of his parishioners was a mirror to his own growing doubt. Lord Geoffrey oversaw the distribution of the meager rations. The portions were barely enough to sustain life, but they were all he could offer. The gratitude in the villagers' eyes was mixed with a palpable sense of fear. Agnes watched her children sleep, their bodies growing thinner with each passing day. Hunger gnawed at them, and she felt powerless to stop it. A mother's love was no match for the relentless grip of famine. Alone in the sanctuary, Father Thomas grappled with his faith. He questioned God's purpose, his silence in the face of such suffering. The weight of his parishioners' despair pressed down on him, threatening to extinguish his own hope. From the ramparts of his manor, Lord Geoffrey surveyed his domain. The endless rain continued to fall, a constant reminder of the devastation that had befallen his people. He knew that the worst was yet to come. The earth offered nothing. Where once plump grains of wheat had grown, now only clung the stubborn roots of weeds, offering little to stave off the gnawing hunger. Agnes clawed at the soil, her fingernails caked with mud, a desperate search for anything edible. Livestock, once a source of sustenance, became a burden. Too weak to plow and consuming what little fodder remained, they were more mouths to feed than assets. Agnes knew the sheep would have to be slaughtered, but even that offered scant relief. One scrawny sheep would barely feed her family for a day. In the flickering candlelight, Father Thomas wrestled with his faith. Prayers for deliverance seemed to echo unanswered in the empty rafters of the church. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? The question gnawed at his soul, a constant companion to the despair that gripped his flock. Driven by hunger, Agnes ventured into the woods, foraging for roots and berries. Knowledge passed down from her grandmother guided her, but even the forest yielded little. Animals, too, were scarce, driven deeper into the woods by the relentless rain and lack of food. The communal pot became a symbol of shared desperation. Villagers contributed whatever they could find, a handful of weeds, a few stray mushrooms, the odd worm, all boiled together into a thin, unappetizing gruel. It was barely enough to sustain them, but it was all they had. Lord Geoffrey, besieged by pleas for help, knew his own stores were dwindling. He rationed the remaining grain with ruthless efficiency, aware that every grain saved was a life potentially spared. But he also knew it was a losing battle. The reserves would not last the winter. Desperation bred desperation. Petty theft became commonplace. A loaf of bread, a turnip, a scrap of meat, anything was fair game for those driven by hunger. The social fabric of the village began to unravel, trust eroded by the constant struggle for survival. Death became a constant visitor. Weakened by hunger, the villagers succumbed to illness and disease. Father Thomas, his heart heavy with grief, performed the last rites with increasing frequency, offering what solace he could to the bereaved. Lord Geoffrey, faced with growing unrest, attempted to maintain order. He spoke of duty, of resilience, of the need to persevere. But his words rang hollow in the ears of those who had lost everything. Agnes looked at her children, their bodies wasting away, their eyes filled with a hunger she could not satisfy. She knew she had to do something, anything, to keep them alive. The thought of abandoning her principles, of succumbing to the desperation that gripped the village, filled her with dread. but the primal instinct to protect her young burned stronger than any moral qualm. Lord Geoffrey penned a desperate plea to the crown, begging for assistance. He knew the chances of a timely response were slim. The kingdom was vast and many villages suffered the same fate, but he had to try. The lives of his people depended on it. The shadow of the harvest had fallen upon the village, a darkness that threatened to consume everything. Hope dwindled with each passing day, replaced by a gnawing fear. The question was not whether they would survive, but at what cost. The relentless rain had become a constant companion, a morbid lullaby to their suffering. Each day, Agnes ventured to her garden, a patch of land that was now more mud than soil. Hope, once a vibrant seed, had withered into a fragile sprout, barely clinging to life. Father Thomas walked among his flock, his heart heavy with each labored breath he heard. The faces that once greeted him with smiles were now gaunt masks of despair. Sickness, born of hunger and filth, was taking hold, adding another layer of misery to their already burdened lives. Agnes watched over her youngest child, his fevered body racked with coughs. The meager rations she managed to secure were not enough to fight off the illness that preyed upon his weakened frame. Each shallow breath was a stab of pain in her heart. Lord Geoffrey surveyed his dwindling stores, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He knew that what little remained would not last the winter. How could he provide for his people when the land itself offered nothing? The somber rituals of death had become commonplace. Father Thomas moved from hovel to hovel, offering solace to the dying and prayers for the departed. Each whispered requiem aeternam chipped away at his own faith. Driven by desperation, Agnes ventured into the woods, hoping to find anything to feed her family. The forest floor, usually teeming with life, was barren, picked clean by others driven to the same desperate measures. Lord Geoffrey addressed the villagers, his words offering little comfort. He spoke of the need for order, of the importance of sharing what little they had, but his words rang hollow in the face of such widespread suffering. He knew his authority was waning, eroded by the gnawing hunger. Alone in the church, Father Thomas wrestled with his faith. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? He prayed for guidance, for strength, but the heavens remained silent, deaf to his pleas. Despite her own hunger, Agnes ensured her children ate first. Each morsel she gave was a piece of herself, a testament to her unwavering love and a desperate attempt to keep them alive. The distribution of grain was a chaotic affair, a desperate scramble for survival. Lord Geoffrey watched, his heart aching, as the villagers fought for their share, the bonds of community fraying under the strain of hunger. The church had become a sanctuary for the sick and dying. Father Thomas worked tirelessly, tending to their needs, offering what little comfort he could. He clung to the belief that even in the darkest of times, compassion could still prevail. The cemetery grew larger with each passing day. Agnes stood by another freshly dug grave, the rain washing away her tears. The wages of hunger were death, and the village was slowly succumbing to its grim embrace. Lord Geoffrey wrestled with the accounts. The numbers painted a grim picture. Their stores were dwindling at an alarming rate, and the crown demanded its share. He had to find a way to feed his people and fulfill his feudal obligations, a near-impossible task. A murmur rippled through the village. Geoffrey's granary was nearly empty, and rumors spread of the crown's men arriving to collect their due. Desperation etched itself deeper into every face. Father Thomas prayed for guidance. The suffering he witnessed daily tested his faith. He pleaded with God to offer some respite, some sign of hope for his starving flock. The royal emissary was unmoved by Geoffrey's pleas. The king demanded his levy, famine, or no famine. Geoffrey argued that taking more grain would doom his people, but the emissary remained implacable. Agnes, desperate, led her children back to the barren fields. They scavenged for anything, roots, weeds, anything to fill their gnawing hunger. But the land offered nothing but mud and despair. A riot was brewing. Frustration and starvation had pushed the villagers to the brink. Father Thomas tried to calm the crowd, but his words were lost in the rising tide of anger. Geoffrey watched, his face grim, knowing he could not appease everyone. Geoffrey addressed the crowd, promising to distribute what little grain remained as fairly as possible. He knew it wouldn't be enough, but it was all he could offer. His words were met with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Agnes received her share of the grain. It was a pittance, barely enough to feed her family for a day. But she clutched it tightly, a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Father Thomas performed the last rites for another victim of the famine. Death had become a constant presence in the village, a grim reminder of their desperate situation. Agnes joined him in prayer, her heart heavy with grief and fear. Geoffrey watched the relentless rain, the sky a perpetual gray shroud. He felt the weight of his responsibility, the crushing burden of leadership in a time of unimaginable suffering. He felt utterly powerless. Agnes stretched their meager portion of grain as far as she could. She watched her children eat, their small faces gaunt, but their eyes still bright with life. It was for them that she would endure. Geoffrey penned a desperate letter to the king, begging for assistance. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. The survival of his people and his own honor depended on it. The hunger gnawed deeper now, a constant companion. Agnes measured out the dwindling grain, each kernel a precious jewel. She knew it wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was all they had. Father Thomas prayed for guidance, for a miracle, for anything to ease the suffering of his flock. The silence of the church was deafening, broken only by the whispers of his own desperate pleas. Lord Geoffrey read the steward's report, each line a nail in the coffin of his hopes. The grain stores were nearly empty, and the villagers were growing restless. He had to make a decision, a difficult, agonizing decision. Agnes walked to the market, her heart heavy. She carried with her a small carving, a precious memento of her late husband. It was all she had left to trade, a desperate gamble to buy food for her children. Hunger knows no law. Driven to desperation, some villagers risked everything to steal from Lord Geoffrey's fields, their actions a testament to the famine's cruel grip. Lord Geoffrey confronted the thieves. He understood their desperation, but theft could not be tolerated. He had to maintain order, even as his heart ached for their suffering. Father Thomas pleaded for mercy, reminding Lord Geoffrey of their shared humanity. He argued that compassion was the only way to hold the community together in these dark times. Agnes approached a traveling merchant, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard rumors of exorbitant prices, but she was desperate. She had to find a way to feed her children. Lord Geoffrey oversaw the distribution of the last of the village's grain. It was a meager offering, a drop in the ocean of their need, but it was all he could do. Agnes watched her children sleep, their frail bodies a constant reminder of her failure. She would do anything to protect them, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Father Thomas buried another child, his heart heavy with grief. The constant funerals had become a grim ritual, a stark reminder of the famine's deadly toll. Agnes made her decision. She couldn't watch her children starve. With a heavy heart, she led them away from the village, towards an uncertain future, a desperate act of survival in a world consumed by hunger and despair. Winter descended with merciless force. The rain turned to sleet, then to snow, blanketing the already barren fields in a shroud of white. The cold seeped into the bones, a constant, gnawing presence that amplified the hunger. Father Thomas knelt in the frigid church, the stone floor biting through his thin woolen robe. His prayers were a desperate plea, a bargaining with a God who seemed deaf to their suffering. He questioned how much longer he could watch his parishioners succumb. From the window of his manor, Lord Geoffrey surveyed the village, now buried under a thick blanket of snow. The smoke from the chimneys was thin and weak, a testament to the dwindling fires within. He knew that the worst was yet to come. Agnes stirred the meager broth, a thin gruel made from scraps and weeds. It was barely enough to sustain them, but it was all she had. The children watched her with pleading eyes, their hunger a constant ache in her heart. Death became a constant visitor. Father Thomas presided over more funerals than baptisms. Each burial chipped away at his faith, leaving him questioning the purpose of his service. Lord Geoffrey oversaw the distribution of the last of the grain. It was a pitiful amount, barely enough to last a few weeks. He knew that he was delaying the inevitable, but he couldn't bear to watch his people starve without a fight. The hunger stole more than just their strength, it stole their spirit. Agnes found herself staring blankly into the void, the weight of her responsibility crushing her. She was running out of hope. Father Thomas wrestled with his faith, the silence of God deafening. He felt abandoned, adrift in a sea of suffering with no land in sight. His prayers turned into desperate cries for guidance. Lord Geoffrey clashed with his steward, the tension thick in the air. The steward warned of mutiny, of the peasants turning against them. Geoffrey refused to believe it, clinging to the hope that their loyalty would endure. Agnes ventured into the frozen woods, desperate to find firewood. The trees were bare, stripped of their leaves, a stark reminder of the desolation that had gripped their world. She knew that without warmth they would not survive the night. Father Thomas, despite his own hunger, shared his meager rations with a starving family. It was a small act of defiance against the despair that threatened to consume them all. He found solace in the act of giving, a flicker of light in the encroaching darkness. Lord Geoffrey sat alone in his manor, the weight of his responsibilities heavy on his shoulders. He knew that the fate of his people rested on his decisions, but he felt powerless against the relentless forces of nature. The winter had tightened its grip, and the shadow of despair loomed large over the land. A faint warmth kissed Agnes's cheek. The relentless rain had softened to a drizzle, then ceased altogether for a precious few hours. The clouds, though still present, were higher, thinner, allowing slivers of sun to pierce through. A tentative hope, fragile as a newborn bird, stirred within her. Father Thomas emerged from the church, his gaze fixed on the sky. He hadn't seen the sun so clearly in months. A silent prayer of gratitude escaped his lips. Perhaps, just perhaps, God had not abandoned them entirely. Lord Geoffrey surveyed the village from the small rise near his manor. He noted the hesitant movements, the cautious hope in the villagers' eyes. He knew this respite might be fleeting, but he also understood the importance of fostering this fragile optimism. Action was needed. Agnes bartered with Alara, trading the last of her dried herbs for a handful of precious seed grain. It wasn't much, but it was enough to plant a small patch of vegetables near their home. Every seed felt like a victory. In the church, Father Thomas led the villagers in prayer. The service was simple, but the collective hope was palpable, a shared yearning for a return to normalcy, a plea for a bountiful harvest. Lord Geoffrey gathered the villagers in the square. He announced a plan to distribute the remaining seed grain fairly, and he organized work parties to repair the irrigation systems. He spoke of the need for cooperation, for sharing the burden, and for trusting in each other. Agnes joined the work party clearing the irrigation ditches. The labor was hard, but the sense of shared purpose eased the burden. As they worked, they shared stories and meager rations, finding comfort in each other's company. Father Thomas, with the help of some villagers, started a small garden behind the church. It would provide some sustenance to the most vulnerable, but more importantly, it was a symbol of hope, a testament to their unwavering belief in the future. Lord Geoffrey oversaw the distribution of the seed grain, ensuring that each family received a fair share. He knew the amount was meager, but it was all they had. He prayed it would be enough. Agnes carefully planted the seed grain in her small garden plot. Each seed was placed with prayer and hope. She imagined the vegetables growing, nourishing her family, bringing life back to their weary bodies. As the sun set, Father Thomas watched the villagers working in the fields. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, but also with determination. He saw a spark of resilience flicker in their eyes, a refusal to surrender to despair. He whispered a prayer for their strength, for their hope, and for the promise of a bountiful harvest. In his study, Lord Geoffrey reviewed the accounts. The situation remained precarious, but the signs of improvement, however minimal, were undeniable. He knew the coming months would be crucial. He made a promise to himself and to his people that he would do everything in his power to ensure their survival and their future. The rains had finally ceased. Spring, though late, had arrived, but the land was scarred and so were the people. The fields, once teeming with life, now bore the marks of the famine's harsh grip. Patches of land remained barren, a stark reminder of the hunger that had plagued them. The church, once a sanctuary of hope, now echoed with the silence of those who were gone. Father Thomas continued to minister to his flock, but the weight of loss hung heavy in the air. The famine had tested his faith, leaving him with questions that lingered like shadows. Lord Geoffrey struggled to rebuild his village. The famine had decimated the population, leaving fields untended and homes abandoned. The economic disruption was profound, and the future uncertain. He knew that the road to recovery would be long and arduous. The social fabric of the village had been torn. Trust had eroded, replaced by suspicion and resentment. The bonds that had once held them together had frayed under the strain of hunger and despair. Agnes saw the distrust in the eyes of her neighbors. Father Thomas wrestled with his conscience. The famine had shaken his faith, forcing him to confront the limits of his understanding. He questioned God's will, struggling to reconcile the suffering he had witnessed with the divine promise of salvation. Lord Geoffrey attempted to restore order, but the task was immense. The famine had exposed the fragility of the feudal system, revealing its inability to cope with such a widespread disaster. The peasants, disillusioned and weakened, looked upon his words with skepticism. Despite the hardship, Agnes refused to succumb to despair. She found solace in the simple act of nurturing the land, planting seeds of hope for the future. The resilience of life, she believed, was the only way to overcome the trauma of the recent years. Father Thomas continued his work, finding new strength in the resilience of his parishioners. He learned that faith was not about easy answers, but about standing with the suffering, offering compassion and hope in the face of despair. He began to heal, along with his people. Lord Geoffrey acknowledged the failings of the old ways. He introduced new farming techniques and sought to distribute resources more equitably. The famine had taught him a hard lesson about the responsibility of leadership and the need for social justice. He set about making changes, however slow. Life slowly returned to the village, but the scars of the famine remained. The memory of the hunger, the loss, and the despair would forever be etched in their hearts. They emerged from the darkness, forever changed but not broken, and Agnes knew this to be true for herself and her family. The famine served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of community. It highlighted the need for compassion, resilience, and a deeper understanding of the human condition. The lessons, hard-won and painful, would hopefully guide them in the years to come. Even Father Thomas knew that their trials were not over. The shadow of the harvest had passed, but its memory lingered. The survivors, scarred but not defeated, looked to the future with a newfound appreciation for the simple gifts of life, food, family, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Agnes stood amongst them, ready to embrace the challenges ahead, for they were, above all, survivors. The immediate crisis had passed. The rains had stopped, and the sun, though weak, shone upon the land. Yet the shadow of the famine lingered, a constant reminder of the hunger and despair that had gripped the village. The fields, though showing signs of life, bore the scars of neglect and exhaustion. Father Thomas continued to serve his community, but the famine had changed him. He grappled with his faith, questioning the divine will that had allowed such suffering. The faces of the starving haunted his prayers, the cries of the desperate echoed in his heart. Lord Geoffrey faced the daunting task of rebuilding his estate. The famine had depleted his resources and decimated his workforce. He knew that recovery would be a long and arduous process, requiring careful planning and unwavering resolve. The demands of the crown remained, a heavy burden in these lean times. The scars of the famine were not merely physical. The psychological toll was immense. Families were fractured, trust was eroded, and the bonds of community were strained. The memory of starvation would forever haunt their dreams. The death toll from the famine was staggering. Villages were decimated, and the population of Europe significantly reduced. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented, leaving a lasting impact on the social and economic fabric of the continent. Modern estimates suggest that 10–25% of the population of many European villages and towns died. The famine exposed the vulnerabilities of the feudal system. The traditional structures of power and obligation proved inadequate to cope with such a large-scale crisis. The reliance on local resources and the lack of centralized coordination exacerbated the suffering. The Great Famine had long-term consequences. It led to economic disruption, social unrest, and a decline in population. The weakened state of Europe made it more vulnerable to future crises, including the looming threat of the Black Death. The famine also sparked religious and philosophical debates. Some saw it as a divine punishment for human sin, while others questioned the very existence of a benevolent God. The search for meaning in the face of such suffering led to new theological interpretations and spiritual practices. In the aftermath of the famine, some efforts were made to improve agricultural practices and food distribution systems. However, these reforms were often piecemeal and insufficient to prevent future crises. The lessons of the famine were, in many ways, not fully learned. Despite the hardships, the human spirit endured. Communities rallied together, sharing what little they had and supporting one another through the darkest of times. The resilience of the people was a testament to their strength and determination. The Great Famine of 1317 stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of human existence and the importance of preparedness. It highlights the devastating consequences of environmental disasters and the need for effective social and political systems to mitigate their impact. It taught a lesson on the importance of strong community to survive disastrous events. As the years passed, the memory of the famine faded, but its lessons remained. Yet, even as the scars began to heal, a new threat loomed on the horizon. Whispers of a deadly plague spreading across the east reached Europe, a harbinger of even greater devastation to come. The Black Death was on its way, and the world would soon be changed forever.